Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Pod Save the Youth. I'm your host, David Seaton.
I'm Delnaz your co-host.
And today we're going to be talking all about the pathway for Democrats to flip the House of Representatives, one of the most important things that Democrats have to do over the next few years to fight back against the Trump administration. And one of the ways that Democrats are going to do that is by flipping very red districts, places where Democrats have to expand their territory and win over Republican voters and independents in order to flip districts and win the House of Democrats. So we're so excited to have someone who knows a lot about trying to flip one of those red districts. Noah, do you want to give a brief introduction?
Absolutely. And thank you both so much. Avid listener, avid fan, and super happy to be here. Very happy to have the chance to talk to everybody here today. So my name is Noah Widmann. I'm a native of Central Florida. More particularly, I live in Seminole County, Florida, which is the county just on top of Orlando. And a little bit about my background. Was raised by a disabled single mom in Section 8 housing. Became a teen dad at 18 and began flipping burgers and bagging groceries, and eventually became an EMT working nights for the fire department while doing community college. And today I'm an attorney. I do a lot of things, but the thing I'm most proud of as an attorney is my representation of folks trying to fight to get their Social Security benefits and other public benefits, similar ones to the programs my mom still relies on to this very day.
Well, we're so excited to have you today. And let's just start by talking about some of the things that have been happening recently electorally as we kind of go into the beginning stages of the lead up to the midterm elections. So on April 1st, Democratic candidate Josh Weil came within 15 points of flipping Florida's 6th congressional district, which borders your district, the district in which you're running for Congress. Um, where a Republican won in the 2024 congressional race by 34 percentage points. Similarly, in Florida's first congressional district, Democrat Gay Valamont came within 15 points also of flipping former Congressman Matt Gaetz's congressional seat, which went to the GOP in 2024 by 34 points. So, Noah, what do you think were the primary drivers of this large electoral shift in your state, where Democrats have been kind of losing hope in recent years of winning much at the statewide level? And what do you think these results from the past few weeks what do you think they mean for the midterm elections coming up?
It's a great question. No, and I think that that's really spot on. Coverage of both races. First thing I'll say, both Gay and Josh were wonderful candidates. I think that they worked immensely hard. They had wonderful people on their team, and they knew that they were in tough territory, but they didn't, forget about Florida, and they tried to fight for local folks and local issues. And I think something that they saw that I see and that so many folks out there see, especially from Florida, but I think also folks that, want to see us gain and regain ground see, which is that voters are frustrated right now for a lot of reasons. But I think a huge thing is how high the cost of living is, the fact that prices keep getting higher and higher, and the inaction, just the complete lack of any action by this Congress or by this administration on their broken promises, right? So, whether it's in deep red Florida, swing district Florida, or blue Florida, or the country as a whole, and this is how it, kind of, I think, reveals a bit about the midterms next year, voters are looking for change, right? And I know that I'm looking for change. That's why I decided to jump in and run. Florida, like you had mentioned, it had been competitive for a long time. Yeah, it's felt less so in recent years. I think that now we're seeing it's going to be competitive again. I think that there's real chance to gain ground, to win over hearts and minds. And basically, for my race, it's much swingier than those two districts. The first and the sixth, as you mentioned, were quite red. The seventh, it's only R+5. Biden got just over 47% of the vote there in 2020. And if we simply improve, and it was a uniform fashion in two congressionals in the same state, if we improve over the 2024 performance the same amount that both Josh and Gay did in their special elections on April 1st, we're going to win that next year. So, I think that reveals a lot about the national environment, the state environment, and the fact that folks put a lot of trust in this Congress and in this president, and that we're not seeing delivery.
Would you credit the shift that you noticed to independent voters, or would you say it's more maybe people on the left who are becoming more mobilized as they see the inaction, as you mentioned?
That's a really good question. I think it's a little bit of all the above, right? So in Florida, and especially in districts like mine, it's a lot of independent voters, third party voters, but as well, it's Democrats that really want to think that they can make a difference, right? And I think that in those specials, we were really seeing the chance for that. I think it's going to take winning over more than 60% of independents. I think we're going to get there. And I think that we're kind of inching up there, not just in Florida, but certainly you've seen, whether it was the Supreme Court election in Wisconsin, uh, you know, state level specials in Pennsylvania, you've seen the shift toward our backs, the wind coming toward our backs. So I think that independents are a key to this, but not the only key.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just talk a little bit more about your particular race down in the 7th district. So, in your district, as you said, Republicans have an 8-point advantage when it comes to party registration. In 2024, where Republicans had a pretty big landslide in Florida at the presidential level, Trump won by 14 points according to Dave's redistricting in the New York Times. So now your Republican opponent, Corey Mills, faces a large amount of sort of of corruption charges and investigations around ethics. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that might impact the race and why you think that kind of disqualifies him from serving in Congress?
Absolutely. I think that everything you're pointing out is accurate. I'm going to start, not just with that, but I think with what races like this represent and what this country, I think, represents to folks in my shoes, your shoes, and so many folks out there. On a personal level, I'm deeply grateful, for my community in Central Florida, for my state, and for this country that gave me the opportunities to succeed. I was a teenage dad flipping burgers and trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And now I'm an attorney that's able to kind of give back a lot of time. And I don't know if that's really possible anywhere else, right? And so, I want to make sure kids out there have the same opportunities I did, and ideally better. I don't know. On a personal level, I'm pretty frustrated by the inaction of Congress. I'm pretty frustrated by, the attacks on programs that made my journey possible. If Social Security's cut, it's not just something I care about as a Dem. It's my mom. If FAFSA and the Department of Education are cut, that's not just something I believe in. That's what made my educational journey possible as a young dad. And so, when we see more and more of these attacks on our vital programs, and then we see more and more corruption from people like Corey Mills, who I don't agree with a lot on a personal political level, but as you pointed out, it's also his behavior, which is unacceptable. And whether it's the ethics investigation by the House, for basically graft for taking illegal government contracts for his international arms dealing company, or the abuse allegations against a young 20-something woman in a DC penthouse that the DC police are investigating now. It's just overall corruption, and it's a troubling big picture. I personally think that Central Florida families deserve better than that.
How do you plan on mitigating the damage that has been done from these attacks? Because many people are kind of just jumping on a bandwagon and following along. They don't understand how deeply, the attacks on Social Security, for example, will impact even them. And so, how can you talk to people who are kind of on the other side of things and believe those false narratives?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot to be said there, but I think it can be summed up in one kind of simple phrase, which is that even if somebody's on the other side of issues with me, or if they have a different letter next to their name, they still have a beating heart. They still have a family. They still have folks that they know and care about that are in need. And what I'm worried about, if anything, I'm actually worried that a lot of those folks are going to come over to our side, because the reason for the worry is that I think these programs are genuinely going to be cut if we don't change something. I think that the minute somebody sees their mother, their grandmother homeless, I think that the minute that somebody sees veterans who already get the short end of the stick and are not given enough credit, enough support in this country they gave so much for, I think more folks are going to see what's going on. And so that's actually troubling, that I think a lot of folks are going to kind of come our way and see that. But I think at the end of the day, we've really got to preserve what we have and then try our best to bolster these programs that we have. Because at the end of the day, people say, oh, well, if, if it's a temporary, attack or pause or bit of, temporary pain, I don't know about you, but, if my mom and I were homeless when I was a kid, that there's nothing temporary about that. That would have been world ending.
How do Democrats make sure that more people hear those stories? How do we make sure that those personal stories are the driving narrative?
It's a great question. And it's a tough question for a lot of folks out there. I think there's twofold. On the front end, there's the fact that you really don't want to swing at every single thing that they throw our way that's not a genuine, attack, whether it's on people's sovereign rights, whether it's on these vital social programs or our basic freedoms. But when it's every single news headline, I think that we could do a better job at standing up for everyday people and making sure that we really bat at the big issues that are affecting people, kitchen table issues. That's the front end. On the back end, though, I think that you actually can do all of the above, because whether it's Corey Mills enriching himself while he's in Congress, he's lining his pockets allegedly illegally, right? Like, that's why he's being investigated by the House Ethics Committee. You're seeing folks in Congress like that get rich off insider stock trading, illegal government contracts, which are alleged against Mills, and so much more, while ordinary folks back home get the same paycheck every week and see their grocery bag shrink and their interest rates go up, right? So I think that what you can really do here is tell the truth. Who are these people serving? And I think that when you really complete that circle, you see that it's not us. And I think that that's another kind of method to really wrap everything together and say that this is too much going on. None of it serves ordinary people.
And as you mentioned, the kitchen table issues, the most kitchen table issue that a lot of people face right now is prices, high prices.
Yeah,
In the first few months of the Trump administration, the president said that he was going to lower prices on day one and instead announced sweeping new tariffs on almost all nations across the world, including close allies like Canada and staunch adversaries like China. While most nations face a blanket 10% US tariff, China has been hit with levies of up to 145%, and it has retaliated with 125% duties on US goods. So these tariffs are resulting in a risk of a recession, as the Fed Chair Jerome Powell said this week before Trump threatened to fire him illegally. And right now, Trump's approval rating on the economy, which was previously over 50% throughout most of the first term and for the past few years, stands at 44%. So, Noah, are you hearing much of these concerns about economic issues from your voters in these districts? How are voters reacting to the tariffs so far? And how do you plan on responding to these concerns with real policies that can actually lower prices and rein in the Trump administration's tariffs?
absolutely. Right here in Central Florida, I'm hearing it from folks, whether it's in Seminole County or down south, just outside of the district in Orlando proper, and everywhere in between, that it's simply not good. I think that ordinary folks reasonably, and I'm with them on this. I mean, ordinary folks reasonably do want us to effectively and intelligently take on China. I think that that's a very valid, good goal, especially in fighting for our American jobs. Attacking our allies and having huge tariffs around the world, that's not the way to do it. And I think regular good folks are realizing that. And sadly, they're feeling it, right? So, a big group that's feeling it are local business owners. I was talking to a woman about 4 days ago who owns a frame shop. So she makes picture frames and painting frames. Like, really, really, really cool store to see, because she had a wide variety of examples of her work, and she wasn't sure if she can plan the next few months. She wasn't sure what to buy in huge bulk, what not to. There's fears that decisions like that, or why the economy, scary enough, might actually look good right now in comparison to later this year, because
Mhm.
there might be kind of this, you know, heating up of buying things now ahead of the tariffs, and that's not real economic activity. That's panic and chaos. My sister, for example, she runs her own hair salon in Castleberry, which is right here in Seminole County. The tariffs are hitting her products. She sees the tariff costs on her charge sheets, and she's not really sure how she can plan ahead. And while a frame business also should not be put in that chaos, every business is different. It's very tough for somebody in the hair industry to buy a giant amount of bulk that might go bad, and even more so for somebody in the agriculture, entertainment, or food space to buy certain things ahead of time because they might literally go bad. Working families, whether they own businesses or not, they're feeling the squeeze of higher prices. They're feeling the squeeze of high housing costs, whether it's mortgage rates or rent or both, and groceries and products generally. It just simply costs more to exist and to live right now, and it's not fair. There's a lot of ways to handle this. I think the easiest way, Article 1 of the Constitution vests Congress with the power of taxation, and Congress had given the president, long ago, this I think it was under IEPA, the power to impose tariffs under certain circumstances. I think that we can rightly, when we flip this seat, work with people on both sides to rein that power in and bring costs down.
So many young people right now are particularly economically anxious. So how are you, if elected to Congress, going to prioritize the economic concerns of our generation through policies like raising the minimum wage, lowering the cost of attending college, and lowering housing costs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm a 20 something. Yeah, I'm a late 20 something, but I'm a 20 something. I was talking to my mom, I think like 2 weeks ago. I mean, we talk every day, but we were talking 2 weeks ago, and she had said something about me owning a home, and I made a half joke about how that's never gonna, I don't see how I'm gonna own a home. And she said, "No, don't say that. That's terrible." And I said, "No, no. I mean, on paper, I just don't see how that's going to work out." That's an optimistic view compared to other folks, in Gen Z and in the millennial, you know, generations. And so there's a lot of ways to approach this. I think the above that I had just mentioned with, reining in tariffs, trying to lower costs, I think that's huge. But college affordability, we need to get back at the drafting board and figure out how to make college cost less. It's the same education that our elders received, but for significantly more money over time. And it's not just the upfront costs. We need to tackle these absurd interest rates that are squeezing folks in our age group. Sadly, people that are 2 and 3 times our age are also being squeezed decade by decade by these interest rates, often paying back 3 times or more what they owe, what they actually took out. And I think that that's wrong. I think there's this common sense way to tackle that. I think we should make it easier to open and keep your local business open. There's a lot of entrepreneurs out there from various spaces, whether it's somebody selling, widgets on TikTok or, running a larger scale business. I think that that's something that folks should be able to do in an era where Main Street's getting squeezed and where Wall Street's kind of getting away with everything. There's other things, like making healthcare more affordable. There's ways to protect and build on the Affordable Care Act. I think we should really look at. There's ways to build on, for example, the last administration capped the cost of insulin for seniors at $35. There's ways to build on common sense things like that that I think would really make a difference for folks. This doesn't come up a lot for young folks, but I, for example, was the age of a high school senior when I became a dad. We need to make childcare more accessible and affordable. I think we should treat childcare like the infrastructure that it is. And often it's single moms trying to get by, single moms like mine trying to get by that are bearing all that on their shoulders. I think we should make it easier for these moms to make it. Beyond that, we need to fight for good paying jobs. We need to fight for higher, wages for folks and more affordable housing generally. There's a lot of avenues to do that, and I think that we should look at all of them. It doesn't just start with the tariff rate. It doesn't just start with trying to bring stability to the market so that interest rates come down. It's going to come to good building of housing in places that aren't, that aren't protected land, right? And that don't encroach on other people's homes. I think there's a good way to do that and to bring abundance to everybody. And I don't know, Corey Mills and Trump ran on lowering costs for working families. They haven't done that. I think we need leaders who are willing to have these conversations, especially folks in my boat, in our boat, people out there that have understood what it's like to choose between the electric bill and groceries.
Having that representation of both our generation and people who've actually struggled in our generation to get by is so essential. You need people in Congress who are, descriptively representing our people. So in Florida on the topic of housing, I know a lot of people in Massachusetts are pretty excited by the prospect of going to Florida, buying a house for cheap with more lax building codes, I guess, than they have here. How do you think red states and Florida in particular should adjust their building codes to both keep costs down, but also tackle the climate crisis? Because the truth is, in a few years, coastal communities are not going to be as cheap to build in because the sea levels are rising, storms are getting worse. And how are you going to tackle both those climate and economic concerns and make sure that your messaging is meeting people where they are?
It's a great question. And it's a hard question that, I mean, frankly, leaders in Washington, leaders in Tallahassee, they're not really willing to do the work on. I think we're seeing time and time again a lot of folks. Let's say that there's a family, for example, from Boston or from Springfield or from Worcester they want to come down and move somewhere wonderful, like Sanford or Winter Springs or Castleberry or Lake Mary or Port Orange, and they think that they're going to be able to afford it because there's no state income tax, as well as other housing code things like we're talking about here. But then they come to find that the property taxes are getting higher and higher, and they find that a lot of companies aren't willing to insure their homes anymore. I think it's scary, to be honest with you, for families like mine and families around me that I grew up with. They're not sure what's going to happen if a hurricane or anything else hits them because their homes just aren't insured the way they should be. And I think that that's something we need to address that does cross state lines. There's some issues here, especially certain code, whether it's codes for building, et cetera, that tend to be more state level, right? Like under, state powers. But there's ways to actually incentivize good building and responsible building that don't encroach on ecosystems, wildlife, preserves nature. And I think that we need to look at that as Congress. If we can incentivize good, affordable housing, abundant housing for good and decent folks, and if we can also push for not having this ridiculous pollution that we're seeing blow up more and more, and that this administration, they're not just fine with, they're signing off on more pollution, more poison in our waters. That's not going to bring costs down and help families. So I think that there's a lot of solutions here, none of which are really being actively sought out. And so I'm excited to flip this seat and actually get to work on helping bring insurance companies back, helping to protect our environment, our treasured resources, and also I think generally speaking to bring back the dream of being able to own a home. I mean, I'm sure you two, like me, are you're not just unsure if you'll be able to own a home one day. It just feels like it won't happen, right? So I think that we need to kind of address all of the above, and I think that it's going to be hard, but it's not as complicated as folks make it.
Before we move on, I want to talk about something we mentioned in an earlier section, which was personal stories. And then just before this most recent question, we talked about how Donald Trump, Cora Mills ran on lowering prices and how that didn't happen, and how now maybe is the time that people are realizing, okay, maybe we should change the way we're doing things. Do you think relatability of a candidate has a lot to do with this? Such as someone like yourself, you've gone through these struggles, you've gone through these programs, such as you mentioned, your mom having to be on Social Security um, for survival, essentially. And so, how much do you think that those personal stories moves voters?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think it matters quite a lot. I don't think background is a one and done thing that's going to help win or lose an election. But I think that when folks know that when you breathe their air, you drink their water, you know where they're coming from, they trust you more, right? And I think that something I've seen as a young attorney and as somebody who's kind of been around folks that are in various walks of life is that there's people in Congress, the majority of Congress, it's not just too old. I mean, that's obviously an issue, right? Like um, Congress, if you're 70, in Congress, you're not you're considered actually quite young. I think that's its own problem. But an even bigger problem is the fact that these folks just don't know the issues facing us. I mean, if you ask a senator or a congresswoman out there, how much does bread cost? How much do you think the average power bill is? Most of them can't answer it. And I'm reminded of this in my advocacy that I did, way back when I was a law student on the farm bill, which that's a huge omnibus bill that covers everything from food stamps issues to school lunch issues to agriculture issues broadly. I did some advocacy work on the farm bill, and something I'll never forget bringing up in a meeting. And these are great folks. I'm not saying anything bad about the people that I went to school with, but a lot of these people that grew up not like everyday families don't really know what's at stake. And when I mentioned that, hey, maybe we should try to advocate for allowing folks that utilize, SNAP benefits to be able to buy something like a rotisserie chicken, with their food stamps. And, two of the students looked puzzled and said, well, why couldn't they do that? And I said, oh, my bad. It's because it's a hot food. And then they were even more confused. Like, what does that mean? And I said, well, since it's technically cooked, you sadly you can't buy it. You can't get it to feed your family. I think that's one of many examples, right? Like my mom being disabled, it was tough for her to cook. It was tough for her to just get me from place to place. I mean, I think my mom's a superhero for getting me to school every day the way that she did for many years. And so for an everyday family, being able to get a rotisserie chicken means everything. And I think that more and more what we're seeing as far as people's stories and backgrounds concerned is that when you get real working everyday people elected to Congress, people who have seen it, done it, and struggled to make it happen, that's when you're going to see real change.
I'm gonna just move on to our one of our last topics of immigration. So one of the central aspects of Trump's political identity is the fact that he supported a tough, southern border and mass deportations from the moment he walked onto the political scene. And when Trump entered office, he was elected decisively by Americans on this issue. But now, a few months into the policy of mass deportations, President Trump has worked with the State Department to deport undocumented immigrants and also US residents who are legally here in the country. One of the most notable cases of this happened a few weeks ago when a Maryland father named Kilmar Abrego Garcia was taken by ICE and sent to an El Salvador prison, a prison in another country, where he was denied due process and the ability to appeal his deportation. And in fact, he was not allowed to be deported to El Salvador because that was a country he was legally seeking refuge from. The administration has also targeted international students, like my fellow Tufts University student Ramesa Ozturk, for expressing their free speech rights and writing an op-ed in a school newspaper, criticizing the school's handling of the Israel-Hamas war. So if elected to Congress, Noah, what will you do to directly fight back against these attacks on the rights of immigrants? And, as Trump said, American citizens are next. So what are you going to do to fight back against these mass deportations and protect our constitutional rights?
I can't believe we even have to have this conversation, to be honest with you. The fact that we're here in 2025 having this conversation is mind blowing. To say that free speech is important in American life is an understatement. It'd be the understatement of 2.5 centuries. It's our free speech rights are quite literally the
Yeah.
First Amendment of the 10 in the Bill of Rights. Um, that's how this country started, was by being able to speak, you know, whatever view you have, whatever side of the issue that you have, without retribution, and depending on the context, with due process, right? Like I'm an attorney, I understand how important that is, and there's certainly a difference between holding a sign and protesting against something that you disagree with, using your voice, etc., and you know something that's actually an incitement of violence or is actually damage to property. Like these are very different things. And I think that one of the people that you mentioned simply just signed on to an op-ed that folks may agree or disagree with, and that was it. And they took her away and took her to a prison. I think that no matter what side of this issue or any issue that you take, Peaceful protest is a right. It's one of the most important basic rights that we have. I'm going to stand up to this administration and any administration that tries to infringe on those rights, no matter how good, bad, and everything in between the views may or may not be. I think that that's just a fundamental aspect of American life. There's a lot of ways to do it, but I think that above all, Congress needs to assert itself as the co equal branch of government that it is, and they need to stop sitting on their hands the way they've been since January 20th.
Are you in talks with any other Democrats about possibly withholding future funding for countries like El Salvador and places that are housing immigrants in detention facilities as
Yeah,
a point of leverage?
it's a that's another important question. I personally have only heard of conversations. I'm not currently in talks about this specific topic. Although one conversation I did have with somebody else running, and I won't say who yet, but with somebody else running for Congress was basically that the most. Oh my goodness, I mean, one of the most. There's too many. The most with this horrific
Mm.
deal that we don't know about with El Salvador. One of the most horrible aspects is this $6 million contract that none of
Mhm.
us have seen. Congress appropriates money. They do taxing, they do spending, they control the purse. Yet this administration has unilaterally decided that it was going to make a $6 million deal to send people off to a foreign prison without due process, without a day in court. There's a lot of things to do there. I think that the most fundamental thing is to see what this deal is and why our tax dollars are being spent on it. Congress has that right. That's something I've only talked about in one short conversation so far. It's something I'm really excited to look at because I think it's a huge problem we need to solve together.
Yeah, I agree. But when we're talking as Democrats about the crisis of, immigration and the immigration particularly at the southern border, often Democrats get into kind of a trap on this issue where we start defending people who are kind of dangerous criminals, and Republicans are at least able to easily frame us like that. So how do you plan on talking about this issue on your campaign in a district where a lot of people did vote for or probably do support mass deportations? Um, how are you going to message as a Democrat with the stances that you are taking here to those voters and convince them, do that actual persuasion on the ground that these aren't the right policies to support?
Yeah. No, I'm going to address it as a Democrat the same way that the folks back home right here address it as Americans, right? Like a good common sense solution. And it starts with telling the truth and it starts with telling the easy and hard truths. So let me be abundantly clear. I support strong borders. I support our border guards and our border police. And I think that we must have and deserve to have a secure border. What we also need is comprehensive immigration reform. Congress has failed year after year, time after time, to deliver genuine change to keep everybody safer. And I think that we need a fair and strong, but emphasis on fair, system where folks can come the right way. The truth is that the system itself is broken. Real solutions and real reform are needed, and that's not going to be easy. I think what's happening now under this administration, however, is deeply unacceptable. Folks are being rounded up without any semblance of due process. They're being sent to a foreign prison for, I mean, I assume for life is their plan. It's horrendous. And, listen, if someone's found to be in a gang committing violent crimes and they're not supposed to be here, I don't think that they should be here. But everybody, no matter how kind, unkind, good or bad, they deserve their day in court. They deserve due process. And I think the system itself is fundamentally broken and is in need of being fixed. Those are hard conversations, but if you talk to anybody, like just any ordinary person, like if I'm on the streets of Winter Springs or Sanford and I go up to somebody and I say, hey, what do you think about this issue? 9.9 times out of 10, an everyday person like me out there, they're going to just say, I think the border should be secure, but I think that good and decent people that are law abiding, productive, good people should be allowed to be here and should be allowed to fight for their American dream. That's what many of our families did. That's what many of our families are doing. And I remember, just over a month ago, it was a conversation, outside of a grocery store, just because I'd run into somebody, whose family was from Venezuela. His family had escaped that repressive government, coming to live here, and have his own American dream. My family did that. A lot of our families did that. So I think there's a way to fix this, and I think it's going to take rolling up our sleeves and doing hard work.
I was going to ask what those conversations would look like with, the folks who, maybe I will say this and see if you have anything to add because I thought you kind of covered it, but I stumbled across a headline, not, unintentionally, and it was framing, I don't remember exactly which person it was who, it may have been the El Salvador situation, and they were saying, oh, this person had a restraining order against them in X year. And what
Hmm.
I noticed is, again, people don't understand. Yes, okay, that's bad, but that's not the point here. The point is they were illegally deported. And so, what are those conversations like telling people, yes, we know maybe they did something bad in the past, but the point is this is illegal. And as you said, everyone deserves their day in court.
That's right. And that's how the conversation goes, right? I think, you know, uh, for different folks, it can mean a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, everybody cares about fairness, right? Fairness requires a lot of things, but in the justice system, it's not a perfect system, but it's the best that we have. In the justice system, that simply is your day in court, your due process. That's whether it's something as horrendous as a DUI or murder or you name it, or something lower on the scale, like going through you know almost running a stop sign and getting pulled over, going 1 mile over the speed limit, perhaps, and everything in between. You're still afforded your day in court. And even if somebody had been, and he wasn't, uh, I believe that was his wife, and that she withdrew that, and that they ended up being fine after that. As far as I know now, I don't know all the facts of that case from many years ago, but you hit the nail on the head when you say, just because you're accused of something, or you did something in the past, that doesn't mean you lose your due process rights. I mean, you're on American soil. You're afforded all those same rights. So, sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but that's kind of what the
Oh, that
conversation
was
looked
great.
like. And you know, one way that I got across from someone I went to high school with was, you know, you got into a fight after football practice one time, like 10 years ago, but that doesn't mean today you should be not given your day in court for something unrelated to that, right?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to get across. Well, to others who I speak to, that this is the most American thing, getting our fair time in court and being able to be heard. Just hope people will begin to see that.
Just to wrap up here, my final question is, Bernie Sanders, AOC have been going on tour of the country, doing these town halls and rallies to juice up Democratic support for candidates in the beginning of the midterm cycle. Other Democrats, like people like Democratic strategist James Carville, have said that Democrats should simply roll over and play dead, have a strategic retreat. What do you think is the best approach for Democrats right now? I can predict your answer, but I want to hear it from you.
Absolutely. Everyone you named is talented in many ways, but I don't think rolling over and waiting for something bad to happen is the answer, right? If somebody's trying to get into your home, you don't wait until they try to hurt you or take your TV before you call the cops. You don't wait for things to get worse. I think that you act. And no matter what your persuasion is, obviously, Bernie and AOC, they do a lot of hard work, and they represent the more progressive wing. But I think whether you're in the more progressive wing, more in the centrist wing, or even a lot of independents out there, and even a sizable number of Republicans, they appreciate seeing those folks fight. like look like they're trying to fight for everyday people. And I think that there's Dems across the spectrum that are doing that well. I admire the willingness to go into, less friendly territory and just talk to everyday people. Don't make folks from the other side out to be enemies because they're not. And show people that we're going to actually deliver lowering costs and making your life better. I think that that's why people from various parties or persuasions can win over folks uniquely well, is just because people want, I mean, this shouldn't be a mystery, right? Like it's funny that, to a lot of folks out there, it's a mystery, but people just want to know that you're going to fight for their family and that you care about them and that you don't look down on them for maybe a past vote that they did in the voting booth, right? And so, that's what Florida families want. That's what Americans want. I think that messaging and truthfully telling people that you're going to fight against the special interests and for the American family, for regular people, I think that that's key. I think that Congress, especially Corey Mills, they're failing to do that. They're failing to do anything but enrich themselves. And I think that telling the truth about that and fighting for folks is the way forward.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Noah, for joining us on Pod Save the Youth today. It was great
Thank
to
you.
have you on the show. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Best of luck in your race.
Thank you all. I can't do this without you, without the wonderful listeners of this show. I admire the work you guys do. I admire the work that I know so many of your listeners are doing. I can't run this race without you. I'm young. I'm a first time candidate. I'm in a similar boat to a lot of you. Please support us and visit noahforflorida.com. So please give us a visit. Please chip in and contribute if you can. We can only do this together.